Good morning, everyone. My name is Avery Kale, and I will be presenting our team's project entitled Restoration for Net Zero, Improving Reporting and Pathway to Impact. I'd like to thank my teammates for their hard work over the last several months and Professor Rosen for her insights and guidance. I'll begin by sharing some background and the problem that we're addressing, as well as sharing an overview of our project. I'll then review our methods for research and data analysis, and I will conclude by sharing major findings and recommendations. The problem that we are working to address is one of overpromising and under-delivering. As companies have increasingly recognized the obligation to curb carbon emissions, more and more of them have committed to eliminating their carbon footprints by a certain date. From 2019 to 2020 alone, the number of companies with net zero carbon pledges increased from 500 to over 1,000. And 53% of those pledges include some form of land restoration to help companies offset some of their emissions. Reuters estimates that $133 billion are pledged annually on restoration projects. This is all good news. A concerted effort within the private sector to curb emissions will be a crucial part of addressing climate change. But companies don't quite know how to actually account for these pledges, and many of them use these restoration projects to simply greenwash their impacts. Restoration projects are particularly challenging to account for a number of reasons. And to illustrate them, we are going to use a hypothetical consumer packaged goods company, which we will creatively call CPG. CPG has committed to net zero carbon by 2050, and they want to offset some of their emissions by planting trees. In order to do this effectively, CPG will have to first prove additionality, meaning that the resulting carbon sequestered and other benefits would not have occurred without these efforts. Secondly, CPG must provide permanence, meaning they have some sort of contingency plan if a natural disaster were to come in and wipe out their progress overnight. Thirdly, CPG must protect against leakage, where protecting and restoring one area would only lead to more logging in another area. And finally, they must ensure that their results are verified by a third party. Otherwise, CPG could really say whatever it wants about how well their project is going. Our client is working on strategies to address all of these challenges. So this semester, we worked with our client, the World Resources Institute, or WRI, which is a DC-based environmental think tank that has operations around the world. Through their Global Restoration Initiative, WRI is working with a coalition of net zero carbon companies to help them reach their carbon goals through land restoration, where methods like reforestation and regenerative agriculture can help the land to sequester more carbon. But WRI believes that these projects are about more than just carbon neutrality, and they asked us to research how these projects can better have impacts on both communities and natural ecosystems. More specifically, WRI tasked us with conducting a thorough review of net zero pledges and providing recommendations for how their partners can strengthen the impacts of their restoration projects on both communities and natural ecosystems. So after reviewing the scientific literature on net zero strategies and corporate land restoration, we wanted to get a better understanding of the current landscape of net zero pledges. So we poured over the sustainability reports of 170 companies over 9 key industries in order to find out what they were reporting and how thoroughly they were doing that reporting. So during our background research, we compiled a list of key metrics across the 2 buckets that you see here on the left, ecosystem services and socioeconomic impacts. We then, for each report that we reviewed, we recorded the presence or absence of all of those metrics. And we also measured how thoroughly they were doing reporting by looking at criteria like whether or not the metric was reported numerically or against a time-bound goal. In the heat map that you see here, the darker the square, the higher that industry scored in terms of metrics reported and thoroughness of reporting, broken down by these 2 buckets. The results here can help WRI focus their efforts on their partners in lower scoring industries. This research and data analysis culminated in the development of our stepwise approach to corporate land restoration. And to illustrate the 7 steps, we're going to return to our hypothetical company, CPG, and remember that they are working to offset some of their emissions through tree planting. So the first step for CPG will be to assess all of their carbon emissions across 3 scopes, including their direct and indirect operational emissions, as well as their emissions associated with their value chain. Knowing that total figure will help to inform their targets and strategies for emissions reduction, which takes us to step 2. Here, CPGs should partner with the Science Based Targets Initiative to help them set targets that are in line with the Paris Accords. Crucially, SBTI emphasizes the limitations of relying on offsets. So they are going to recommend that CPG try to abate around 90% of its emissions through switching to renewables, shifting to more sustainably sourced inputs, and working with suppliers to help them shift to lower emitting practices. And after that, that's when SBTI will help CPG to set feasible offsetting goals to tackle that remaining 10% of emissions. And that is where land restoration will come in. So from there, CPG should establish a partnership with a restoration NGO, given that tree planting is not in their wheelhouse. Let's say that CPG's demand for palm oil has contributed to deforestation in the Amazon. We would urge CPG to use their restoration projects to repair some of the ecosystems and revitalize communities that they've harmed in the past. So they might choose to partner with World Wildlife Fund, who conducts robust restoration efforts in the Amazon. In the next step, CPG will collaborate with World Wildlife Fund to determine the scale and scope of their project. And they will also conduct community engagement with local and Indigenous communities in the Amazon in order to build up trust and ensure that their projects will be supporting those communities however possible. The next step is implementation. And here CPG will provide funding for boots on the ground. This is also when CPG will establish channels of communication with World Wildlife Fund's project managers and local community leaders. Together, they will set interim targets and establish a regular check-in schedule. The next step will be for CPG to track progress, and to do so, they should work with World Wildlife Fund to decide which metrics from our list will be applicable to their project. They will also work to identify targets that are not on our list that will be relevant. So for example, in the Amazon, it will be important to measure the impact on Indigenous populations. So they might do that by looking at the number of Indigenous people in management positions for these projects, or the change in income for the communities. The final step will be to verify and report. And so for verifying carbon credits specifically, we recommend that CPG work with one of the leading carbon verifiers that you see here on the left. All of these verifiers are known to address the challenges of additionality, permanence, and leakage that we talked about earlier in the presentation. And for reporting more broadly, we recommend that CPG use all 3 of the reporting frameworks that you see on the right side of the slide. The more reporting frameworks used, the more robust the measurement and reporting of these projects will be in order to ensure that the reports are accurately reflecting the impacts of these projects. I'll now conclude by sharing some key takeaways from our research. Firstly, when approaching land restoration through the framework that we have developed, it becomes more than just a quest for carbon neutrality. In keeping with WRI's holistic perspective on land restoration, this framework can help companies to conduct restoration that meaningfully engages with communities and ecosystems in order to actively repair harm rather than simply balancing a carbon budget. There are still many challenges that we are facing in this realm. So firstly, the reporting score that we have given these companies did not reflect an overall positive environmental impact, since our scoring is not currently weighed against the company's overall impacts and emissions. Secondly, the restoration projects will require frequent updating and adjustments in order to maintain their positive impacts. And finally, because of the lack of standardization in reporting, corporations some of them will still use these projects as a way of greenwashing their impacts. That being said, land restoration is crucial to human well-being, ecosystem health, and climate stabilization. And it is one of the many moving parts that is required to reach net zero. Our findings will show WRI which aspects of land restoration are going well and which need improvement. And our recommendations will help WRI to make those improvements by giving their partners a roadmap that they can share, that they can use to conduct effective land restoration to the benefit of all stakeholders. Thank you. And I'll now take any questions.
Nice job, Avery. I was wondering about the metrics. So you mentioned those different industries that you looked at, but I would imagine the metrics that each of those industries report are probably different. So did you happen to look at that? And if so, did you find anything unique or just generally speaking?
Yeah, we actually, we included a sneaky little slide just in case that question came up to actually just show the list of metrics that we used. So you could see up on the top, the green ones are the ecosystem metrics we used. They included things like biodiversity, water contamination, freshwater withdrawal. And then the social ones included things like jobs created, job training, and women's empowerment. And our report will show all the different units that we used and the ways that these things are measured. These were all informed by the background research that we did on those reporting strategies and the methods themselves for land restoration.
Thank you, Avery. Very, very nice presentation. I have more of a pragmatic question. So you said that you have CPG that wants to restore a forest, but they need to reach out to WWF, and then they have to have a verification, and then they have to put it in a framework. Like, who's coordinating all of this? Because I feel like it could become like a logistical nightmare, and it would be really easy for them to just be like, never mind, right?
Yeah. So great question. That's exactly where our client comes in. So it's funny, this project, we were almost consulting for a consultant. WRI exists, this effort really exists for WRI to help companies with these net zero carbon pledges to implement all of these different steps. And so having this roadmap will help them take the companies through all these steps to get to that end goal of effective restoration. And so they have relationships with these restoration NGOs, governments, and businesses to sort of facilitate all of this work.
Thank you. Good job, Avery. My question is just, could you please clarify the geographical scope of the project? So were these 170 companies like US based or around the world? And then what effect that would have on like the verifiers that you've chosen and the reporting standards? Because obviously they'll like differ based on the location.
Right. So this, our stepwise approach was meant to cover restoration globally. So in our report, again, there will be specifications by region of restoration conducted. And then the companies that we looked at were from all around the world. Many of them were American, but not all of them. And these, for these global companies, many of them have offices in the US. And so those verifiers are available for any of them to use. The one caveat is that some of the, science-based targets, for example, they have just recently announced that they will no longer be working with oil and gas companies. And that's because they don't want those companies to be continuing with business as usual. And so for them, we have in our report, again, provided alternatives that they can use.
Great presentation, Avery. This might have been outside of the scope of your project, but I was curious if in your research, you were able to find what role WRI may be able to play as an international NGO towards establishing like the sustainability accounting standards that you mentioned are lacking.
Yeah. So WRI itself is an NGO. They're a think tank. And they have strong relationships with NGOs doing restoration work all over the world. So they can work as far as encouraging their partners to follow these robust steps and perhaps working with other parties like them to make this a more ubiquitous practice. But they will not directly have the power to enforce these standards. That will have to come from the government and They can, again, work with governments to try to make that happen, but it is ultimately not up to them, unfortunately.